Welcome to the InfoTech Growth Partner Podcast, the podcast where we dive deep into the IT, how the future of IT unfolds, where we're speaking with IT and data leaders and experts in the IT consulting field. My name is Jasper, and today I have the pleasure of speaking to Yosef Fried. Yosef has a rich experience in several roles within technology, has been an executive in several international companies. So it's a pleasure to have you on, Yosef. Thank you for joining.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the time and opportunity to join you, Jasper, and talk about things that are important to all of us, especially those who spend our times inside and outside of computers.
Likewise.
Clouds.
Thank you. Thank you. Very important indeed. Can you give the listeners and the viewers a bit of an introduction into your own background and your own experience?
Sure. I've sort of spent probably 25 plus years in mostly enterprise software, from sort of the deep gutsy stuff of IT management, ITSM, et cetera. I spent 10 years at BMC, and 6 of those I was the VP corporate development. So that was a time when we really built out what we call business service management, which was expanding the capabilities of what before that was really just sort of managing individual components. And we made quite a few acquisitions, Remedy, Marimba, Blade Logic in those times to sort of build out our position, and built a very good, stable business around that, which is still going at BMC. And then I spent a little bit of time as an investment banker. Went back to sort of working with companies, which I enjoyed a lot more, and did a lot of work around alliances, so sort of how do ISVs figure out who is the best alliance partner out there, how can I work with them, how can I co-sell, how I can utilize their infrastructure and sales and name recognition to help my business along. Worked a lot with SAP in 2 different roles. In the last role at Centrical, we became an endorsed app, which is, at that time, there was only about 7 endorsed apps within the effort. And we did, really nice deals with SAP, through SAP at BT and LG, Verizon, et cetera, which we couldn't have gotten the audience and sort of the size of the deals on our own. So I think, that's sort of where those vendors can be very helpful. And now we see a lot happening in the cloud vendor space, which is sort of not totally new, but sort of them being very much a, if you look at sort of the old Microsoft, Intel, Dell models, where sort of things worked as sort of there was a very clear infrastructure, or very clear set of sort of how things went to market. I think that the cloud vendors are becoming more and more of sort of the focal point or center of how both customers buy, how ISVs deliver, how consulting companies need to sort of manage that hybrid and cloud environments. So, and of course, sort of LLMs and AI sort of also figures into that. So I think there's a lot of things coming together that's really transforming how we need to do business, right? The underlying stuff is kind of the same, but the way we need to do business perhaps is changing more dramatically than it has in a while, right?
Yeah, and as you already talked about it, and I think you also written some articles about cloud vendors and how the market has been changing. I think it's very relevant to the audience as well, to the listeners as well, to who are ISVs, who are those consultancies, who are deep into the trenches and actually experiencing those changes. But just for the general listener, can you tell us a bit more about how is this buying and selling landscape for cloud vendors changing, and maybe give some examples so that people can really see what the change is about?
Yes, I think there's probably a few things to think about. One is just the size, right? So there's obviously some really big ISVs out there, whether it's Oracle or Salesforce or Microsoft. But if we look at the size of the size and sort of this dramatic growth rate that we're seeing around the cloud vendors, right? Primarily that's AWS, GCP, and Azure, but Oracle's also sort of popping up on the radar. So it's not just a trilogy, but there's going to be more. But the huge amount of just actual sales. And those sales are not just across applications that are built by vendors, right? They're sort of across applications that are built internally. They're across applications that are built externally by a partner, right? So they sort of have a really big footprint within the organization. So, when people are signing on to, work within AWS or GCP, it's for a huge swath of IT that beforehand was sort of, juggled among hardware vendors, or not even chips was sort of part of it, but hardware vendors, infrastructure vendors, VMware, applications, people, et cetera. And now it's solidifying into one place, right? So sort of it's that footprint is sort of everything goes, right? I can go to a hyperscaler and buy access to a chip, right? Which I couldn't really have done before. I had to buy a computer or buy a server or to a network or to access to the internet or to infrastructure or to an application, right? So I'm buying all kinds of things on that, which is a little bit different than sort of the traditional, sort of coming through one channel, and one PO to sign. And they're really working around usage. So right beforehand, I bought a server or a computer. It didn't usually matter the usage. There are exceptions to that sort of in mainframe, but for the most part, I bought some hardware. And really the cloud vendors are all about usage, which is good on one hand, but also I don't always know how much I'm going to use, right? It's sort of, how much electricity will my electricity bill be this year? But they've also sort of built in commitments to that, right? So you do have to commit. And the interesting thing that came out, Infosys just brought out some numbers that there's about 47% of unutilized commitments out there, right? So there's sort of this race against time where the vendors, right, the AWSs and Googles need customers to meet their commitments because they don't want to come there at the end and say, you only use 30% of it. That doesn't work out really well. And the customers they've got some built-in discounts to it. So they've got a reason to sort of do these commitments. And sort of the cool thing that these guys have put in is that if you're a third-party ISV selling on one of those marketplaces, that counts to that company's commitment. So that's a little bit of an aha moment, right? And it's an aha moment because it allows them to sort of meet their commitments through ISVs. But what it really did is decouple the sort of the inherent synergies that I expected. So if I went to market with Oracle or Salesforce or SAP, so whether it's CRMs or HR, whatever, the expectation was an ISV or as a partner, right, is that there was some sort of product synergy between my product and your CRM, right? I added something onto it, right? I had some sort of technical integration between them. And if it really becomes a buying sort of thing, which is happening with the cloud vendors, we've really decoupled that. So I'm just putting it, basically, I'm sort of using it as an advanced credit card, right? And it has sort of credit card rates. It's pretty low to solve some of my IT problems. So that's sort of interesting, is that I don't necessarily have to think, at least ostensibly, around that integration. And that's a very different set of rules, and the numbers are crazy, right? There's about 15 billion in software sales going through these guys. Folks like CrowdStrike have announced, they publicly announced that they've done $1 billion through AWS, right? Snowflake also seems to be in sort of that range. So that, there's a lot of money going through these vendors. And that's catching up or potentially beating sort of the traditional sort of, I'd say, platform players, the ERP, CRMs, HR, which again, they've got that coupling, which is sort of inherent in their model. And also their model is a little bit more expensive, right? They sort of take a higher number, these marketplaces are sort of taking, a couple percentage points. It really is, and they're making it very easy to buy, right? They're sort of simplifying that buying experience. So it's really changing the way customers are buying, and it's changing the way ISVs are selling, right? So I think there's some legitimate reason why it's growing so fast.
Yeah, yeah, and I think you mentioned an example of, for example, NVIDIA that is doing this as well, leveraging those cloud vendors to drive their own business.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate a bit more on, let's say, a real world example so people can understand like how does this really look like, or what does this mean for the broader tech ecosystem?
I think the fact that I can go and I can buy NVIDIA off of the cloud, and then and in the same sort of environment, I'm also going to go and run my ERP system because SAP Rise is going to run on one of the cloud vendors. And also, I've got some data. I've got a big data warehouse that I want to run, and if perhaps it was on premise, I want to move it to Snowflake or Redshift. I'm also going to run that, right? Sort of all from the same vendor, and these are tightly connected, right? Because now I want to do some AI on top of that. Snowflake, I'm going to get some more compute, from NVIDIA. So it really it's a big supermarket of software and hardware, but it's really the first time the supermarkets worked, I'd say. And again, that sort of disjointness is the unique part, but that's the way they're buying, right? Now it creates some tension, right? Because I can buy, for example, and this is just an example, I can go in if I want to build a data warehouse, I can build it on Redshift, or I can build it on Snowflake. So the way that it's positioned to companies is, if you sort of want to do a do-it-yourself thing, go Redshift. You sort of want to have it all out of the box, go Snowflake. But who made money at the end of the day in either case? AWS.
Yeah,
Same goes with there's different types of other applications that, again, but they also create some overlap, right? Because there's probably a little bit of overlap between some of the capabilities that I have in infrastructure from AWS that I might have from Oracle or SAP that I'm running a sort of on top of that as an ERP or other application. Okay, so at a high level it looks sort of neat, but when you get into the ditches of selling, what am I going to use? Am I going to use sort of just the basic stuff of AWS or GCP, or maybe I'm going to start to use some of those other capabilities and services that they've offered that are really easy to get to, right? I mean, you can go and sign up to AWS tomorrow, and you can sort of, start spinning up servers and on the pennies on the dollar, and start playing and building like a pretty sophisticated infrastructure,
yeah,
and it's all virtual, right? I can sit in wherever I want in the world and not just have access to a PC, but have access to GPUs and servers and networks for sort of pennies on the dollar if it's low
yeah,
usage, which is pretty cool, right? I mean, that's definitely opens up the complexity of a system that I can build. And
yeah,
the other example is just we go back to to sort of COVID, right? And all of a sudden companies had to sort of build different types of unique systems to sort of deal with that, right? So I remember some of the airline systems needed to, ask all kinds of questions. Have you taken a test, right? Now, if they would have built it on their old existing systems, right, they'd still be, knocking away at that today. So they built it on these cloud systems, and you would see sometimes it would sort of pop out of their app, and if you look at the URL, sometimes you'd see sort of, an AWS in there or something, where it was going back and going to that, but they were to bring this stuff out in, weeks, days, months, as opposed to, years, which was sort of, maybe the more typical IT project. So it really worked, right? It proved that you could do transformational things pretty quickly from people in their houses, right? Nobody was at corporate headquarters. They're all from their houses, all sort of popping away at GCP or Azure, sort of building funky stuff that they needed to run their business,
yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly. And how you explain it, it looks all to be good news, all great, customizable, very quick. You can do it yourself, etc. That's all good. I guess, what we all see that the dominance and the power of those cloud vendors is becoming way more prevalent.
Yeah.
The Azures, the AWSs of the world, they're really solidifying their position, which I think is good. There's a lot of good options. But looking at the broader spectrum of the market, like specifically those smaller companies who don't have that dominance, that power, that leverage, what do you see in the market? What challenges do these companies, these guys face, and how do they or should they, from your viewpoint, navigate those challenges?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and sort of puts people in a little bit of a bind, right? On the one hand, things are sort of opened up, right? And also, I think people are buying. You can buy more over the phone or over the internet or through a marketplace. So that's like a good set of things for a smaller vendor. It sort of opens up the world. On the other hand, you see a lot of power concentrated among some vendors. It seems that companies, there was an Infosys report that was pretty comprehensive that came out a little while ago, and they said companies are looking to sort of take multi-cloud approaches, right? So it's not just I'm going to put all my money in one. And we also see things like Alibaba or Oracle, others sort of building out their own cloud. So I think, it won't just sort of be the big three over time. It'll be more, which is probably good for the market. So we're not, monolithic. I think monolithic, sort of success stories are probably bad for the industry. But if you're a little vendor, right? So like, how do I think about it? And we can sort of look at it in two different sort of buckets, right? There's sort of the ISV, right? Somebody that's developing some sort of software and needs to get it into the customer's hands. And then there's all the consultancies that are building and selling, or either reselling those or building, creating services, building services, migration around that. And they sort of got to look at it a little bit differently in terms of, how they navigate that. So I'd say maybe if you start from the ISVs, they need to look at a few things. They need to say, okay, who do I want to partner with, right? How much resources do I have? Can I partner? Can I join 2 or 3 programs, or is that like a little bit too much? And why do I want to join those programs, right? So there's sort of, I'd say, sort of a pragmatic, relatively short-term objectives that they can get, and then there's some long-term things. So the short-term things are, one of the sort of the benefits of a marketplace is I can have consistent contracts and T's and C's. So if I'm a small vendor and I want to go and sell to a big bank in Germany, it's going to be really, I could, go through, sort of that procurement process could take me literally months, right? And it could be for a relatively low sum of money, right? So I'm just going to, go back and forth the red lines with some lawyer who's got nothing better to do than make my life difficult. Not very effective. However, if you use the T's and C's of that cloud vendor, it's just sort of a sign off, and literally people get things done in days, right? So it's really easy. So that's sort of like a pragmatic thing that I can get without having to be, I don't have to be known. I'm just using it again to sort of make that buying process, that procurement process easier for me. So how do I decide who I'm going to go for, right? It's going to be AWS, GCP. So number one, if you're running on one of those vendors, you're usually going to sort of get a little bit of a heads up, because they'll use some of your existing spend as sort of a way to sort of move you into a better program, so that I can make sure that I have access to it, I can sign up relatively quickly, and the sellers on that other side will get compensated for that, right? Because I want them eventually to say, oh, yeah, I'm working with this organization, never heard of them before, but they seem to be doing some deals, right? Me and my buddies, we got together and we found out, hey, it's like adding to my commission, so that's good. After that, you sort of need to think about, okay, once I get past that sort of that basic level, I want to sort of really be co-selling and right, having them bring me deals or stuff. That's going to require much more effort, longer time frame, and I really got to be, I'd say, a lot more thoughtful about how do I do that and who I'm going to join. One of the blogs I have sort of a litany of things to consider when you're doing that. Do I have is there a GTM organization that sort of aligns with what I'm doing? Going back to that decoupling, if I'm going to do co-sell, I either really need to be very focused on finding the right part of that cloud organization that cares about me, right? They care about data or security or infrastructure or data disk, whatever it is. Or I need to be big enough that it just doesn't matter, right? That I just can push enough stuff through that people go, that's easy money, right? Because they are compensated on marketplace deals, right? That sort of is the way they look at the world is basically is more utilization and more marketplace deals, I'm going to make better money, right? That sort of is the structure. So that's from the ISV perspective. If you look at it from a consultancy perspective, right? So I think there's again this sort of like what two levels, right? The first level is, do I have the skills, right? Do I have the folks that know those cloud things and can go to a company and with high level of confidence say, I can start to migrate some of your stuff, move it, right? Take some homegrown stuff that was, who knows, built on an AS400, and I can move it relatively quickly to the cloud. So that's, I think, a base level. But there's also a little bit of sort of like a little bit of a mind think that we need to twist around, right? Because again, what are they trying to do? These companies and the organizations are trying to get utilization up as they start to wind down these commitments, which means that the more projects that are going to go live, the more of that commitment can be utilized, and the more old systems can be turned off, right? So there's sort of that balance. So when you talk to the cloud vendor, if you can say, hey, I've got a project going that's going to now have all the data sitting on Snowflake, that's going to make Snowflake happy. It's going to make whoever the cloud vendor underneath is very happy. It's going to make the customer happy because now they can get off their old iron and move it to it, right? And that wasn't really as much of a consideration in sort of the on-prem world. It's like, I got a server, I got to buy some new servers, but it really wasn't, it was part of it, but it wasn't really the driving. This is really a driver of it. So I think that's one thing to consider. The other thing is, I think sometimes vendors, especially those who were reselling, felt that they were getting left out of the party, right? Because for a while, there was sort of a direct ISV to customer structure within the marketplaces, but the partners really weren't part of that. There wasn't a mechanism to say, hey, I've got a deal. I'm going to run this stuff at a customer, but I did the selling, right? How do I get compensated? So now they're introducing, this is a relatively new in 2024. AWS is starting, I'm not sure the others, but they generally tend to copy paste. So that now if I've got a partner I've been working with for years, right? There's a way to make sure that they get compensated in the process, which I think is really important because people have developed relationships. Those guys have a lot of knowledge around that set of products. They might need to sort of do a little switcheroony to the sort of the cloud environment, but at the end of the day, that's their business, and especially if you're sort of like a partner-led organization, partner first, it's really important to be cognizant of these guys have got mouths to feed and families and everything else. We can't let them out. So I think that's an important addition that is very, very, very very, very crucial in making sure sort of all the people who are involved in the projects are duly compensated.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And that's especially those partnerships, those strategic partnerships, channel partnerships is how you call it, alliances, whatever. We engage with a lot of those smaller consulting organizations, and we see that for whatever reason, whether it's time, whether it's not really seeing the opportunity in working with those big vendors, we see that there's still a lot of, let's say, low-hanging fruit and well, as you mentioned as well, long-term partnerships that you can utilize there because most companies or most leaders within those companies are expecting maybe, well, we do a channel partnership, we get a deal next month from them, and we can leverage that. That's not the case. Just as, let's say, the IT consulting space is relationship based, Like you need to have built some trust, build some awareness with people, build some urgency. That's essentially the same in those channel partnerships as well as what we've seen. You need to find the right people, as you mentioned, within those cloud vendors who is aligned with your initiatives,
Right.
who knows that you guys can deliver on the promises that you have, and from that slowly nurture that relationship, like show that you can deliver on what you promise. Also, be of value to the vendor as well. Like you can do, as you said, co-selling, co-marketing is also something very interesting, very important. Each of the parties can bring in people into a webinar, into a workshop, whatever. So we see that really those consultancies underutilize the potential of those cloud vendors, those partnerships. Um, Maybe I think we've talked about it already a bit, but how do you think and how do you see that those consultancies, but also those ISVs, need to change their approach to sales, business development, and marketing? You, of course, yourself have a rich experience in alliances as well. So can you tell us a bit about more on how should those smaller businesses change their strategies, their commercial strategies, to be able to leverage those
Right.
partnerships with those vendors?
So I think there's always sort of this assumption. If you speak to the ISV or the cloud vendor, it's like I want to get them to produce leads, right? It's sort of I want a lead
Yeah,
machine, right? And then the consultant
yeah,
will say I want a lead machine, right? So everybody wants everybody else to lead. However, I think that there's some programs that have been put into place by the cloud vendors that allow you to, for instance, if I want to do a webinar or an event, I can bring somebody in from, say, AWS or GCP to speak, right? So I add number one, sort of, a known, right? It's not just a warm-up act, but I can add somebody who's, sort of like, is an approved speaker by that vendor to come in and talk about something that's interesting, right? The latest, cool stuff around LLMs or whatever, is there's plenty of things to talk about that can put people either on a webinar and a Zoom, and obviously if you have an AWS, a GCP, or Azure behind that, that can be helpful. Now you got to come up and sort of drive that activity, but you're not on your own, right? You're getting some leverage from that vendor and their name on it, et cetera. And I think they're really good at giving. There's also like a lot of training material, so you can actually develop some content that's sophisticated and that meets the needs of your market, and they'll essentially will create leads and pipeline for you, which is what you're trying to do going forward. So I think if you need to be a little bit proactive, but there's
yeah,
some relatively low-hanging fruit type of opportunities that you can do to make that happen. And as time goes on, I think they're investing more and more people and more resources to make it happen. They realize that to sort of feed that ecosystem, you need to feed that ecosystem. Look at sort of Microsoft 20 years ago, right? They knew how to sort of the care and feeding of their resellers. They were really good at that, right? Salesforce is also really good at sort of the care and feeding of their ISV partners across and of their delivery partners, right? Salesforce does very little of their own professional services. So I think like the cloud vendors are sort of learning that you really need to, have the right caring and feeding going on to
yeah,
create an ecosystem that's going to be lasting. And now I also have this competition between Microsoft and GCP and AWS, right? Everybody's going to sort of up the ante as to who's going to be the easiest to work with, right? Whether it's back-end systems, whether it's payments, et cetera. So take advantage of that, right? Take advantage of a little
yeah,
bit of like some movement going on here and be able to put, forward some interesting ideas that's going to utilize that hugeness that they have and the money that's behind that name recognition to get in front of your customers in a very valuable way, right? I think, sort of, it's not just pushing your product, right? I think there's sort of just push product is sort of, not the way people come to events, right? It really needs to be something that's interesting, that's informative, that gives me perspective that I didn't have before. If you can do those type of things, I think you're naturally going to create more business opportunities, right, more deals. So, that would sort of be something to think about, to be thoughtful about going forward.
Yeah, and just as you mentioned, like everyone is expecting to go into a partnership and expecting the other party to bring them leads first. It's a bit of a chicken and egg
Yeah,
problem, sort of, is how you can call it. Everyone is expecting the other party to bring in deals and to themselves get the better end of the deal, sort of, maybe in the short term. But how we really see it and how you explained it as well, you should view it as a long-term thing. You should view it as building leverage together, building an audience together, building a pipeline together. And yeah, you cannot expect to let deals come in 1 month, 2 months, 3 months from now. But you need to find a way to make it a win-win. And there's tons of opportunities,
yeah,
both for the cloud vendor and also for the ISV or the consultancy to get wins from those partnerships. But you cannot see it from a viewpoint like you should give me first, then I give back. That's not how you should do it, and how it's not going to turn out
right.
successfully. Um, we discussed a lot, Joseph. Maybe let's touch upon a bit about the future trends.
Hmm.
Of course, based on your rich experience, you're staying very up to date on cloud vendors, technology vendors, etc. What are the main trends that you're seeing, and how should the industry or companies within this industry, people within the industry, take those trends into account?
Right. So there's like a few sort of pragmatic things and also some things that we can sort of think about, but we don't necessarily have the answers, right? But one thing to sort of pragmatically right now, so everybody, ChatGPT all of a sudden showed up in the world in 2023, shocked the hell out of everybody, and all of a sudden, a lot of vendors have basically taken usually ChatGPT because it definitely has more capabilities and it's easier to sort of talk to, and implemented or embedded it into their systems, right? And they sort of had to do it because if you weren't, walking the walk and talking the talk, you were in trouble. Well, LLMs don't think like people, right? If I ask you to pass me the salt, I use very little compute to pass me the salt. If I ask you to solve a complex calculus question, you're going to use a lot of compute and be very thoughtful about it. Well, tokens in LLMs are they don't care, right? They don't work that way. Passing the salt in a complex question, the same amount of tokens, it costs the same amount. So now as I've embedded these LLM capabilities into my system, because I had to, if people are asking really simple questions, that could have a lot of cost on my bottom line. And all of a sudden my usage to ChatGPT is really high and people aren't really they're just asking to pass the salt, right? But they're spending a
Yeah.
lot of money to getting it to pass the salt, right? As opposed to asking really complex questions. I think it's something to be thoughtful about is what type of queries are my customers using? And is there a better way to do it, right? Do I need all the knowledge that ChatGPT or Sora in the future will have to offer in terms of also sort of interacting with the real world in video? Or maybe I can find an open source LLM or another vendor that has something that's really more specific to my needs and won't cost me as much, right? It doesn't have every time I do a query essentially on ChatGPT, I'm going through all of the knowledge it's created. Well, I don't need all of the knowledge and all of music videos, right, to understand it, to figure out a business problem, right? So be thoughtful is, how can we sort of use LLMs that, again, might not be as cool, might not do all the same stuff, but for my needs are really important. And for my, for the cost structure is really important. So I think that's important. The other thing to think of in this is I heard an interesting podcast between Sam Altman and Lex Friedman. They mentioned, right, compute, right? Sort of that's an unknown factor because if we thought about sort of chips, the example he gave was we thought of like chips in cellular telephones. So if I'm a cellular telephone chip maker, I go, well, there's 8 billion whatever people in the world. 75% of them or 90% of them need a phone. They only need one phone. So I need to build this amount of chips this year, and there's probably some some mistakes I can make, 2 or 3 or 5%, but pretty much I know how many chips I need to make. Well, how much do I need in terms of compute, which we know is hugely inefficient, right? And it's electricity, right? Do I have enough electricity to drive compute, right? Do I have enough data centers and the the OpEx and the CapEx that needs to be invested in that, right? It's deep pockets. Do I have enough chips? How many chips do I need to design? Well, it depends. Am I going to use AI for my car, my home, my business, my personal assistant, doing everything, a robot, or am I just going to use it for, getting funky answers and jokes off the internet, right? Huge difference, right? So it sort of is like, I don't know, it's hugely elastic. And that's something that not everybody understands, but going back to, we got to sort of be thoughtful about what we're using the right environments right now. A lot of these are going to be cloud, right? So who has, the ability to build data centers, the opportunity, the money, deep pockets to sort of spend huge amounts of capex on building these out, can buy chips in bulk and get them available and allow me to sort of just go magically, I need a GPU, please, spin it up from Intel or whatever. Those are going to be the cloud vendors. So again, they sort of remain a big part of this ecosystem. I got to be careful again. It's that sort of, that I don't get a sort of a runaway type of thing where all of a sudden I'm spending huge amounts of money on that. But that seems to be sort of like an open question for the industry, is how do I get that, compute, to the extent it's like, do I get electricity from solar or from nuclear, right? Because I need so much, right? It's like a heady problem, not just next screen on my HTML cool thing, whatever. And also as LLMs become more, right, sort of LLMs are sort of like a compressed version of the world because they're only language, right? It's naturally compressed and simple. As LLMs as AI needs to become more advanced and needs to sort of take video in, right, and the real world in, the bandwidth now expands, the need for compute expands, and that's sort of, if we want them to be really intelligent, they sort of need to understand more of the world, right, and to really do other things. So that's, again, something that I think we'll start to see, and we need to adapt to as we move forward. And this, it's moving, right? It went from nothing to, I can put an LLM on my computer and run, connect it to my home assistant and run my house with my own little private LLM. There's some pretty funky stuff out there. But again, what's the cost, right? What's the cost and what's the security impact, right? Does now sort of everybody see what I'm doing? So there's some things we need to think about going forward that are very pragmatic.
Yeah, that's of course always the thing with the next big thing. Like we've seen a lot of things in the past, of course, the internet, of course, big data, those types of things. Now it's AI. Again, there's big value in it, but there's a lot of considerations that you need to take care of before you can actually drive real, lasting, long-term business value from it. And just as you mentioned, things like security, things like compute costs, those are still very important to take into account to make sure that the business value is there. So very relevant, and thanks for sharing. I think in this whole conversation, we've covered a lot of topics, a lot of helpful things for cloud vendors, ISVs, consultancies, people that are working within the industry. So thanks for sharing. If there's anyone that wants to learn more about these topics or wants to talk to you, wants to just have a chat with you, what would be the next step, or where can people find you?
LinkedIn, right? The new Rolodex of the world is probably the easy way to reach out, and happy to sort of have a conversation and discuss things with folks, and help us along.
Yeah, I will put the link to your profile in the comments as well, so or in the description, so people can definitely find you. Well, thanks, Joseph.
Thank you,
Thanks for the very interesting.
I
Very
appreciate the
interesting
opportunity,
conversation.
and I like the way sort of that you run the conversation. It was a good good experience for me as well, and I'm glad we could sort of enlighten some folks about some things that they should be to be thinking about.
Exactly. I always learn more from these conversations, and I hope the audience does as well. So thanks, and we'll probably talk later at a later stage again,
Awesome,
because I think there's some more topics that we should cover that are very relevant within the industry. So thanks again,
pleasure.
and looking forward to speaking to you again.
Take care. Bye bye.
Bye bye.